The city of Königsberg sat on the southeastern shore of the Baltic Sea, a Prussian city at the edge of the German-speaking world, famous above all for one philosopher. Immanuel Kant had never left Prussia. He had built a complete system of reason, morality, and aesthetic judgment from the rooms of that city, walking its streets at the same hour every afternoon for decades, constructing in his mind a world of pure abstraction that he believed could ground the practical life of free and rational persons. On the 14th of October, 1906, a child was born in that same city who would spend her life both inhabiting and contesting the tradition Kant represented, who would find in his writings on aesthetic judgment the conceptual resources for a theory of political thinking, and who would argue, in the long wake of the catastrophe that engulfed Kant's Europe, that the tradition of Western political philosophy had failed to understand the nature of political life from its very beginnings. Her name was Hannah Arendt, and she was born into a secular Jewish household of the educated German middle class, the only child of Paul and Martha Arendt. Paul Arendt was a gentleman, an electrical engineer of liberal sympathies and genuine cultivation, who introduced his daughter early to the pleasures of serious reading and to the habits of sustained intellectual attention. He died when Hannah was 7 years old, in 1913, of the late complications of syphilis contracted years earlier, and his death left an absence in the household that Martha Arendt filled with her own formidable energy and political consciousness. Martha was a social democratic voter, a woman who believed in civic participation and kept careful notebooks recording her daughter's early observations and questions. These notebooks, preserved among Arendt's papers, suggest from their first pages that the child was not merely bright, but constitutionally unable to accept received answers. Hannah would not take a statement on faith, not from adults and not from books. She required arguments, and when the arguments were insufficient, she said so, and when she was told that the arguments were beyond her age, she pressed further still. After her father's death, the family moved briefly to Berlin and then returned to Königsberg, where Martha eventually remarried, bringing her new husband's 2 daughters into a household that was warm, if structurally complicated. Hannah grew up in this extended family with the habits of a serious reader and the temperament of a natural philosopher. By the time she was old enough to think about university, she had read through classical philosophy with an appetite that was difficult for her teachers to satisfy. She was particularly seized by Kant and by the question his third great critique pressed on her. What exactly is the capacity we exercise when we judge something, when we say that a thing is beautiful or right or worthy of admiration, and why does that judgment feel like it ought to be shared by others, even though it cannot be derived from a rule? She would carry that question for the rest of her life without ever fully resolving it, and the unresolved nature of the question was, in the end, a philosophically productive condition rather than a failure. She enrolled in the philosophy faculty at the University of Marburg in the autumn of 1924, drawn there by the reputation of a professor whose lecture courses had become, by word of mouth, the most discussed in Germany. Martin Heidegger was 35 years old, married, the author as yet of no major published work, and already one of the most electrifying intellectual presences in European academic life. He had been trained by Edmund Husserl, the founder of the phenomenological movement, but he was using the tools of phenomenology for purposes that Husserl had not intended, returning to the most ancient philosophical questions and stripping away centuries of accumulated interpretation to ask them again as if they had never been asked. What is being? What does it mean to exist here, in this world, as a being that knows it will die? What is the relationship between the particular human life and the vast structure of existence in which it finds itself situated without having chosen to be there? His students felt that he was doing something in those rooms that had not been done in a long time, not analysing previous philosophers, but actually doing philosophy, performing the thinking rather than reporting on it. Arendt sat in his lectures, and she was, by every surviving account, as seized by them as anyone else in those rooms. She was 18 years old. The intellectual formation and the personal relationship that developed between them overlapped in ways that cannot be cleanly separated. She was his student, and she was also, beginning sometime in 1924 or early 1925, his lover, in an affair conducted with the secrecy that his married position required and that cast a shadow, long and complicated, over both their subsequent lives. The relationship was not simply a young woman swept away by an older man's charisma. Heidegger recognized in Arendt a philosophical intelligence of the first order, and the letters he wrote her make clear that he was corresponding with someone he understood to be a serious thinker in the making. She, in turn, absorbed from his thinking a method and a set of questions that she would never fully leave behind, even as she arrived at conclusions about political life that were, in every important sense, opposed to his. She left Marburg by 1926, moving first to Freiburg to study briefly with Husserl himself, and then to Heidelberg, where she worked under Karl Jaspers for her doctoral dissertation. Jaspers was a philosopher of strikingly different temperament and conviction. Where Heidegger was solitary and oracular, inclined toward the unsayable ground of being, Jaspers believed that philosophy was essentially a form of communication between distinct human persons, that genuine philosophical understanding could only emerge in genuine dialogue, in the willingness to be actually changed by another's argument rather than merely to receive it and hold it at a distance. Jaspers's own philosophy was concerned with the limit situations of human existence, with the experiences of suffering, guilt, struggle, and death that force a person to confront what he or she truly is. But the mode of his philosophizing was radically dialogical. He wanted to think with someone, not at them. Arendt would remember this distinction for the rest of her life, and it would eventually become, in her work on the relationship between thinking and political action, a central conceptual resource. Her doctoral dissertation, completed in 1929, examined the concept of love in the thought of Augustine of Hippo, the 5th century philosopher and bishop whose writings stood at the origin of the Western Christian intellectual tradition. The choice of Augustine was philosophically deliberate. Augustine was the thinker of beginning, of the radical novelty that enters the world with each human birth, of the creature who arrives in existence as something genuinely new and unrepeatable. He was also the thinker of the tension between loving the world and knowing that the world is not one's final home, a tension that Arendt found philosophically productive rather than merely theological. The dissertation traced the structure of love in Augustine's thought, with a precision that revealed its author as someone who had already mastered the art of close philosophical reading, who could move through a text attending to the argument's structure while keeping hold of the largest questions it was answering. She was 23 when she completed it. That same year, she married Günther Stern, a philosopher who published under the name Günther Anders, and they settled in Berlin. Stern was a man of genuine philosophical gifts and a cousin, by a remarkable coincidence, of Walter Benjamin. The Berlin they settled into in 1929 was already beginning to fracture. The Great Depression was arriving. The Weimar Republic was managing a polarization between the communist left and the fascist right that its parliamentary institutions were not designed to contain. The atmosphere of the city was changing in ways that anyone paying close attention could feel as a kind of barometric pressure dropping through the floor. Arendt was paying attention. She was also beginning to understand, in a way that her university formation had not required her to understand, what it meant to be a Jew in Germany at this particular historical moment. She had grown up secular, comfortable within the German intellectual tradition, at ease with the assumption that the universalism of German Enlightenment thought applied to Jews as fully as to anyone else. What was happening in the streets of Berlin in the early 1930s made this assumption increasingly difficult to sustain. She began reading the history of European anti-Semitism, began thinking about the specific and peculiar situation of Jews within the modern nation-state, began taking an interest in Zionism not as a political position she fully endorsed, but as a phenomenon that deserved serious intellectual engagement. When Hitler became Chancellor in January of 1933 and the burning of the Reichstag in February gave the new government its pretext for emergency rule, Arendt did not wait to see what would follow. She agreed to help the German Zionist organization collect and document examples of anti-Semitic propaganda from the Prussian State Library in Berlin, an act of quiet political commitment that required her to handle materials that, if she were caught, could constitute evidence of subversive activity. She was caught. The Gestapo detained her for 8 days, questioned her at length, and then released her, apparently satisfied or uncertain, or both. She left Berlin within days, crossing into Czechoslovakia and making her way by stages to Paris, where her mother Martha was waiting. The Paris years, from 1933 to 1940, were the years in which she became, in the most practical sense, a political thinker rather than merely a philosophical one. She worked for Youth Aliyah, an organization that arranged for the emigration of Jewish children from Europe to Palestine, and this work gave her a direct education in the machinery of statelessness, the documents that determined whether a person had legal standing, the borders that determined whether a person could cross, the bureaucratic procedures by which a human being could be rendered legally invisible while remaining physically present in the world. She would theorize this experience in her later writings on the figure of the refugee, arguing that the refugee's plight reveals something the tradition of human rights had preferred not to acknowledge, that the supposedly universal rights of man were in practice the rights of citizens, enforceable only within political communities capable of recognizing and protecting them. In Paris, she also encountered Walter Benjamin, who was living in similar precarity, reading methodically in the Bibliothèque Nationale and working on a vast, never-to-be-completed study of 19th century Paris and the dream world of capitalist modernity. Benjamin was one of the most original minds she had encountered anywhere, a critic and philosopher who moved between literary analysis, theological reflection, and historical materialism with a freedom that was entirely his own. Their friendship was intense and mutually admiring. She trusted his judgment on her own work, and he trusted hers, and their conversations in Paris in those years were part of what formed her thinking about history, about what the catastrophe they were living through actually meant, about the relationship between memory, political action, and the obligation to the past. In 1936, she met Heinrich Blücher, a German of working-class background who had been active in the German Communist Party through the 1920s, before breaking with it during the Moscow trials of the mid-30s, when Stalin began systematically purging the party's own leadership. Blücher had no university degree. He had educated himself through voracious reading in philosophy, history, and military theory, and he possessed an intellectual energy and a gift for argument that matched Arendt's own. They fell in love, and after her divorce from Stern was finalized, she married Blücher in January 1940. 4 months later, Germany invaded France, and the French government, in the panic of the early weeks, ordered the internment of German nationals living in the country, including the Jewish refugees who had fled Germany precisely to escape the German government. Arendt was sent to Camp de Gurs in the foothills of the Pyrenees, a large and badly administered facility that held thousands of people in conditions that combined administrative indifference with genuine physical hardship. She was there for several weeks. Then France signed the armistice, the camp's administrative apparatus fractured in the chaos that followed, and the gates of Gurs were effectively opened. She walked out and travelled north to find Blücher. The months that followed were among the most desperate of her life and among the most practically instructive. She and Blücher were stateless, without reliable documents, trying to find a route of escape from a continent in the process of murdering its Jewish population. They needed visas, transit papers, passage on a ship. The American journalist Varian Fry was running a rescue operation in Marseille, using a network of contacts and a good deal of resourcefulness to help artists and intellectuals assemble the paperwork they needed to get out, and through Fry's organization and their own efforts, they eventually obtained what was necessary. Walter Benjamin, making the same attempt, did not succeed. He reached the Spanish border at Portbou in September of 1940, only to find it closed, and he died that night in his room at the hotel, apparently by an overdose of morphine tablets he had been carrying for precisely this eventuality. The news reached Arendt later and stayed with her for the rest of her life. She spent years afterward working to ensure that the manuscripts he had pressed on friends for safekeeping would eventually be published. She and Blücher sailed from Lisbon in the spring of 1941 and arrived in New York Harbor in May, her mother Martha with them. New York in the 1940s was full of European Jewish intellectuals who had made the same crossing. Philosophers, scholars, critics, and scientists who had brought with them the habits and commitments of a culture that had been destroyed and were trying to continue its work in circumstances it had never anticipated. Arendt wrote political journalism for the German-language émigré newspaper, worked as an editor at Schocken Books, and through the 1940s worked steadily on the historical and theoretical project that would become The Origins of Totalitarianism, reading widely in the history of European anti-Semitism, the political theory of empire, and the growing body of testimonies and documentation about the concentration camps and the Soviet labor camps that were beginning to reach the West. Blücher taught at Bard College and at the New School for Social Research. Their apartment on Riverside Drive in Morningside Heights became a gathering place for the émigré community and for the American intellectuals who moved in its orbit. Mary McCarthy, whose needle-sharp intelligence and absolute editorial standards Arendt admired intensely, became her closest American friend, a friendship sustained by voluminous correspondence and by the kind of fierce argument that both women found more nourishing than agreement. McCarthy would become Arendt's literary executor after her death, completing the editorial work on the final manuscript and ensuring it reached print. Arendt became an American citizen in September 1951. The Origins of Totalitarianism had appeared earlier that year, and its reception made her one of the most discussed political thinkers in the English-speaking world. She was 44 years old. She had survived the flight from Germany, the internment at Gurs, and the loss of a world. She had written a book that tried to understand how the worst things in that world had come to pass. She would spend the next 24 years asking what followed from that understanding, and what, if anything, could be built in its wake. She taught at Princeton, at Berkeley, at the University of Chicago, where she was appointed to a professorship in 1963, and finally at the New School for Social Research, which suited her better than any academic institution she had been part of, because its culture was more tolerant of the kind of thinking that does not fit established disciplinary boundaries. The late years were also the years of her most concentrated philosophical work. She was moving toward a grand account of the three fundamental activities of the thinking life, a project that proved in the end larger than the time she had left. Heinrich Blücher died of an aneurysm in October 1970. Arendt's grief was acute, and she did not fully recover from the loss of a companionship that had been the central fact of her intellectual life for 30 years. She continued to teach and to write, but those who knew her well said that something had gone quiet in her that had been the source of much of her energy. She was working on the final project of her intellectual life, an examination of the mental activities of thinking, willing, and judging, when she died at her Riverside Drive apartment on the evening of December 4th, 1975. She was 69 years old. 2 volumes of the work were complete in draft. The third, on judging, had not been written. When her friends arrived, they found her seated at her typewriter with a sheet of paper in the carriage on which she had typed a title and 2 epigraphs and nothing more. The Origins of Totalitarianism appeared in the spring of 1951, and it arrived in the world as something for which there was no ready category. It was not a work of history in any conventional sense, not a theoretical treatise, not a political tract, and not a memoir, though it drew on all of these at once and obeyed the rules of none of them. Its author had spent the previous decade assembling an enormous archive of European historical writing, political theory, colonial administration, and testimony from the camps, and out of that material she had produced a book in 3 parts that argued, with accumulating force, that the totalitarian regimes which had murdered her contemporaries in the millions were not a sudden eruption of madness into an otherwise sane political order, but the endpoint of a long and identifiable European development. Understanding that development, she believed, was the precondition of any serious thinking about politics in the world the catastrophe had left behind. She had begun writing in New York in the early 1940s, while the war was still in progress, while the news from Europe was still arriving in fragments, and the full scale of the destruction was not yet known. She wrote in German at first and then shifted, deliberately and consequentially, to English. The decision to write in her adopted language rather than her native one was not merely practical. It was a statement about the intended audience and about the nature of the argument. She was writing for readers who had not grown up inside the European political tradition, who did not have its assumptions built into the furniture of their minds, and who therefore might be capable of seeing things about that tradition that its inheritors had difficulty seeing. English also held her, as she observed, at the distance necessary for analysis. To write in German about German political failure would have been to work inside the very conceptual world she was trying to examine from outside. The book opens with the history of European anti-Semitism, and it is here that her method becomes immediately apparent. She is not writing about anti-Semitism as a timeless hatred rooted in religious difference or in some permanent feature of human psychology. She is writing about a specific historical phenomenon with a specific historical structure, and she insists from the beginning on that distinction. The Jew hatred of medieval Europe was, in her account, a form of religious antagonism with its own internal logic. Jews were hated as the people who had rejected Christ, who lived among Christians but refused the conversion that would have made them fully legible within Christendom's categories. This was a terrible form of persecution, but it was persecution for reasons that made sense within a particular theological framework, and it had particular limits. It did not require the elimination of Jews from the world. It required their conversion, or their subordination, or their expulsion. It operated within a religious universe in which Jews had a role, however degraded, and that role, however contemptible, gave them a place. Modern anti-Semitism, in her analysis, was structurally different. It emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries alongside the rise of the European nation-state, and it was tied, in ways that required careful tracing, to the specific situation of Jews within that political form. Jews in the early modern period had served as court bankers and financial intermediaries for the royal houses of Europe, a position that gave them a peculiar relationship to the state. They were protected by the sovereign in exchange for financial services, and were therefore dependent on the sovereign's continued goodwill rather than on any legal standing of their own. When the absolutist states of the old regime gave way to nation-states organized around the idea of popular sovereignty, the Jews' position became suddenly precarious in a new way. They had been associated with the power of the court at the very moment when court power was becoming the symbol of everything the new politics was replacing. Through the 19th century, Jews were granted legal emancipation in country after country, while simultaneously remaining socially distinct, excluded from many of the institutions and professions that defined civic life. This peculiar combination, legally equal but socially marginal, created exactly the conditions under which anti-Semitism could transform from a prejudice into an ideology. The Jew could be represented as both assimilated and unassimilable, simultaneously within society and a threat to it from within, and these contradictory representations could feed each other in ways that made them very difficult to refute. The more Jews tried to assimilate, the more the anti-Semite could point to this as evidence of infiltration. The more they remained distinct, the more the anti-Semite could point to this as evidence of irreducible separateness. The ideology was designed to be unfalsifiable, and this logical closure was part of what made it politically durable. A charge that cannot be answered by any behavior on the part of the accused is a charge that no behavior can refute, and such charges, once they have enough social momentum, become self-sustaining. The Dreyfus Affair, which convulsed French public life in the 1890s and into the early 1900s, occupies a central place in her analysis of this period, and she gives it more sustained attention than any other single historical episode in the first part of the book. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army who was falsely accused of treason in 1894, convicted on fabricated evidence, stripped of his rank before a public ceremony of degradation, and sentenced to solitary confinement on Devil's Island off the coast of French Guiana. The affair divided France along lines that cut across the traditional left-right spectrum. On one side were those who believed in the Republic's legal processes and therefore believed Dreyfus had to be acquitted once the evidence of his innocence became clear. On the other side were those for whom Dreyfus's guilt was a necessary fact independent of any evidence, because the French army and the French state required a Jewish traitor. What Arendt finds analytically significant in the affair is not simply the anti-Semitism, which was already well documented, but the political logic that the affair revealed. The Dreyfusard camp, which eventually won and secured Dreyfus's exoneration, understood itself as defending the Republic, the rule of law, the principle that individuals must be judged by evidence rather than by their social category. The anti-Dreyfusard camp understood itself as defending France, the army, and social cohesion against the disruptive claims of abstraction that the defenders of Dreyfus were making. The conflict, as Arendt reads it, was not simply between justice and injustice, but between two incompatible visions of what politics is. One that privileges procedure, individual rights, and the integrity of legal institutions, and one that privileges national solidarity, institutional authority, and the social necessity of having enemies who explain collective failure. Arendt reads this affair as a dress rehearsal for the politics of the 20th century, and the figure she focuses on most sharply is not Dreyfus himself, but the political journalist Theodor Herzl, who attended the degradation ceremony in 1895 as a correspondent and was so struck by the spectacle, by the crowd shouting death to Jews as the condemned officer was stripped of his insignia, that he concluded that Jewish assimilation into European society was impossible and that the only solution to the anti-Semitic question was the creation of a Jewish state. She does not entirely endorse Herzl's conclusion, but she credits the perception that drove it, the perception that the liberalism of the European nation-state, the ideology that had promised equal treatment under law, had revealed in the affair a fundamental incapacity to protect those it had promised to protect when the political cost of doing so became inconvenient. The second part of the book moves to a subject that had not previously been connected to anti-Semitism in any systematic way: European imperialism. This is the section that many readers found most unexpected and most original, because the connection between the colonialism of the 19th century and the totalitarianism of the 20th is not one that the conventional histories of either phenomenon had drawn. Arendt argues that the expansion of European powers into Africa and Asia in the second half of the 19th century was not simply an economic phenomenon. It was also a political transformation that invented new ways of ruling over human beings and new ways of thinking about human beings that could then be re-imported as a set of habits and precedents to Europe itself. The key mechanism in her argument is what she calls the boomerang effect. European administrators in the colonies, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, developed techniques of bureaucratic rule that operated outside any legal framework, that treated the populations under their control not as subjects with any standing, but as an undifferentiated mass to be managed, moved, exploited, or eliminated according to the needs of the administrative apparatus. Joseph Conrad's great novella about the Congo, which Arendt reads carefully and with some ambivalence, is for her a document of this process. The horror at the centre of that darkness is not simply the violence, which is terrible but not without precedent. It is the discovery that the violence can be rationalised, that the European mind can accommodate the extermination of entire peoples if those peoples can first be defined as belonging to a lesser category of humanity. What Conrad's narrator carries back from the Congo is the knowledge that this accommodation is possible, and the horror of this knowledge is that it cannot be unlearned. The racial ideologies developed to justify colonial rule did not stay in the colonies. They returned to Europe in the minds of the administrators, the soldiers, and the political movements that drew on the vocabulary of race for domestic purposes. She traces in particular the Pan-Germanic and Pan-Slavic movements of the late 19th century, movements that took the colonial logic of racial hierarchy and applied it to the European political landscape, dividing humanity into races with inherently different political capacities, and arguing that the natural order required a hierarchy in which the superior governed the inferior. These movements also brought back from the colonial experience a model of political organisation, the administrative decree rather than the legal norm, the emergency order rather than the constitutional procedure, that would become, in the hands of the totalitarian movements of the 20th century, the template for a new kind of rule. The point at which anti-Semitism and the racial ideology of imperialism converge is the point at which totalitarianism becomes possible. She is careful not to argue that the convergence was inevitable, that the logic of these two histories made totalitarianism unavoidable. She is arguing something more precise, that these developments produced elements, habits of political thought and administrative practice, that totalitarian movements could assemble into a new and unprecedented form. The elements existed before the assembly. But the assembly was an event, not a foregone conclusion, and this distinction matters enormously for how she understands the moral weight of what happened. If the catastrophe was inevitable, it cannot serve as an occasion for judgment. If it was contingent, it cannot be simply accepted. The book was widely reviewed and widely argued over in the years after its publication. Isaiah Berlin and others felt that Arendt's grand historical argument came at the cost of careful empirical attention to specific historical contexts. Others found in its very ambition a form of intellectual honesty appropriate to the scale of what had happened. To read the first two parts of The Origins of Totalitarianism is to understand that Arendt was not trying to produce a historical explanation in the ordinary sense. She was trying to show that a catastrophe of this magnitude had a history, that it did not fall from the sky, and that understanding the history was the beginning of understanding what it demanded of those who survived it. The book's political reception was complicated from the beginning by its equal treatment of Nazism and Stalinism as instances of the same structural phenomenon. In 1951, this was not an uncontroversial position. Many on the intellectual left, who had spent the 1930s and 1940s maintaining that the Soviet experiment was something categorically different from fascism, found her comparative analysis either willfully blind to the distinctions or deliberately polemical. Defenders of the Soviet Union read the book as anti-communist propaganda dressed in the language of political theory. Conservative anti-communists, on the other hand, sometimes claimed it for their own purposes with equal distortion, treating it as a straightforward denunciation of everything the left had ever advocated. Arendt resisted both appropriations, insisting that the book was not a policy argument and was not designed to serve either side of the Cold War. It was an attempt to understand a political phenomenon that had appeared in history and to understand it clearly, and the clarity required treating the two systems in the same analytical framework precisely because the most important thing about both of them was not their surface differences, but the structural feature they shared. The attempt to establish total domination over human beings as such, not in the service of any traditional political interest, but in the service of an ideological law that consumed everything before it. She revised and expanded the book several times after its initial publication, adding a preface for the 1958 edition and a substantial new concluding chapter on the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, which she read as evidence that the loneliness she had identified as the ground of totalitarian rule could, in specific circumstances, be overcome, that people who had lived for years under totalitarian conditions could still discover, in the moment of political crisis, the capacity for genuine collective action that the regime had tried to destroy. The Hungarian revolt lasted only a few weeks before Soviet tanks crushed it, but Arendt found in its brief existence a demonstration of the political possibility that her analysis of totalitarianism had seemed to foreclose. Human beings could still act, still begin, still create the space of appearance between themselves, even after everything the century had done to make this impossible. This was not a comfortable reassurance. It was the beginning of a question she would spend the rest of her working life trying to answer. The third and final section of The Origins of Totalitarianism contains Arendt's most radical philosophical claim, that what the Nazi and Soviet regimes had instituted was something genuinely new in the history of politics, something for which the existing categories of political thought were entirely inadequate, and something that therefore required not just a new analysis, but a new way of thinking about what politics is and what it is capable of doing to human beings. The claim was contested from the moment the book appeared, and it has been contested ever since, but the contest has not, in the decades since publication, resulted in a refutation. Political theorists who worked within the established frameworks of Western political thought, frameworks built around the concepts of tyranny, despotism, and authoritarian rule, objected that Arendt was exaggerating the novelty of totalitarianism by ignoring the long history of brutal political regimes. Ancient tyrants had done terrible things. Medieval rulers had conducted massacres. The Ottoman Empire had committed what Arendt herself would describe elsewhere as a genocide against the Armenians in the early 20th century. Why was the totalitarianism of the mid-century genuinely different from these precedents rather than simply a more powerful version of the same pattern? Arendt's answer was precise and, once followed, difficult to dismiss. Traditional tyranny, however brutal, was organized around the ruler's interest. The tyrant killed people because they were a threat to his power, because they had wealth he wanted, because they belonged to a group that had opposed him, or because he was cruel in ways that served his pleasure. Even the most murderous traditional despots were operating within a political logic that, however repellent, was comprehensible. They were pursuing their own advantage through the instrument of power. The populations they ruled could, in principle, protect themselves by becoming useful to the tyrant, by demonstrating loyalty, by removing whatever characteristic had attracted his hostility. Totalitarian rule operated on a different principle entirely. The Nazi regime did not kill Jews because Jews had done something specific, or because eliminating Jews served some identifiable political interest of the regime in the ordinary sense. It killed Jews because racial ideology defined Jewishness as a biological category that was incompatible with the existence of the racially pure state, and because the logic of this ideology, once accepted, led not to the management or subordination of Jews, but to their physical elimination from the world. The Soviet regime under Stalin did not purge party members because they had actually committed counter-revolutionary acts. It purged them because the law of historical necessity, as the party interpreted it, identified certain categories of persons as objectively belonging to the class of the enemy, regardless of what they had actually done or thought. There was no way to protect yourself from this logic by changing your behavior, because your crime was not your behavior, but your existence in a particular category that the ideology required to be criminal. This is the distinction that Arendt presses with the most sustained force, the distinction between rule that operates according to political interest, however brutally understood, and rule that operates according to an ideological logic that runs through persons rather than attending to them. The tyrant is, in a certain distorted sense, interested in the people he rules over, because he requires them, as a source of tribute, as a labour force, as soldiers, as witnesses to his power. The totalitarian movement is not interested in people in this way at all. It is interested in the working out of a law, whether the law of nature as the Nazis understood it, or the law of history as the Soviets understood it, and people are the material through which this law works itself out. Their individual lives, their individual characteristics, their individual desires and fears and capacities are irrelevant to this process. They are the medium, not the subject. Arendt describes the concentration camps as laboratories, a word she uses deliberately and with full awareness of its force. They were places where the totalitarian conviction that everything is possible was put to the test systematically. That conviction, she argues, is the deepest premise of totalitarianism, the belief that human nature itself is not a fixed constraint on what politics can do, but a material that can be transformed, eliminated, or replaced. The camps were designed to test this premise by creating conditions in which the human person was stripped of everything that had previously been thought to constitute personhood. And the test was, in its terrible way, conducted with scientific thoroughness. She traces this process in 3 stages. The first is the destruction of the juridical person, the removal of all legal rights and legal standing, so that the prisoner has no recourse, no appeal, no standing in any court or before any authority. The prisoner is simply outside the law, placed in a relationship of pure physical power with the administrative apparatus that holds them, with no institutional structure to mediate that relationship. This is why the camps had to be located outside the normal legal order, outside the territory of the state itself in important respects, because the logic of the camps was incompatible with any legal order whatsoever, and the contamination had to be contained. The second stage is the destruction of the moral person, the deliberate creation of conditions in which the camp prisoner cannot act from moral convictions, because any expression of solidarity, any attempt to help another prisoner, is turned into an instrument of punishment by the administration, punishing both the helper and the helped. More fundamentally, the conditions of the camps were designed to make moral choice impossible in the traditional sense by making every choice a choice among evils, so that the prisoner could not make any decision without participating in their own or another's degradation. Martyrdom, Arendt writes, is made impossible in the camps because the death of any individual is too anonymous and too undifferentiated from the deaths of thousands of others to carry the moral weight that martyrdom requires. The camps dissolve the individual death into a statistical process, and in doing so dissolve the meaning that resistance and sacrifice had always derived from the particularity of the person who performed them. The third and final stage is the attempt to demonstrate that human spontaneity itself can be eliminated, that the capacity to act, to surprise, to do something unexpected can be so thoroughly conditioned out of a human being that what remains is neither alive nor dead in any politically meaningful sense. A thing that functions physiologically but has no initiative, no interior response, no capacity for the kind of beginning that, in her later work on the active life, she would identify as the specifically human quality of every person. The camps were organized to produce this condition, and the fact that they could produce it, even partially, was for Arendt the most philosophically alarming aspect of the entire enterprise. It demonstrated that the human quality she was trying to name was not a metaphysical given, but a political achievement, something that required the support of political institutions and social conditions to be sustained, and that when those conditions were systematically destroyed, the quality could be systematically eroded. The comparison between the Nazi and Soviet systems, which Arendt drew with considerable care and considerable qualification, was the most politically contentious aspect of the book's reception. She was not arguing that the two systems were identical, or that the specific crimes of one could be morally equated with the specific crimes of the other, or that the historical contexts in which they arose and the ideologies by which they operated were without meaningful differences. She was arguing that they shared a structural feature that distinguished them from all prior forms of political brutality: the attempt to transform human nature itself through the mechanisms of terror and ideological conditioning. Both moved, in her account, toward a form of domination that was genuinely total in the sense of admitting no sphere of human life that fell outside its claim, including the interior life of the individual subject to it. The difference between the two systems that Arendt emphasizes most consistently is the difference between their ideological foundations. The Nazi system was organized around the law of nature, which it interpreted as requiring the elimination of inferior races in order to allow the superior race to flourish. This was a biological ideology, and its logic required an enemy defined by birth. The Jew was an enemy because of biological descent, not because of anything done or believed or chosen. The Soviet system was organized around the law of history, which it interpreted as requiring the elimination of certain class categories as obstacles to the historical process. This was a historical ideology, and its logic required an enemy defined by class position: the kulak, the bourgeois, the counter-revolutionary, defined by their relationship to the historical process as the party understood it. In both cases, the logic of the ideology ran ahead of the individuals it processed. The enemy was not a person who had done something, but a category that the ideology required to exist, and the category was prior to any individual member of it. This is the sense in which both systems were genuinely totalitarian rather than merely tyrannical. They were not managing a population for the benefit of a ruler or even of a governing class. They were attempting to make the population conform to a law that was greater than any person or group, a law that the rulers themselves claimed only to serve rather than to have created. The book ends with one of Arendt's most carefully drawn conceptual distinctions, one she returned to in different forms throughout her work. She distinguishes between loneliness and solitude. Solitude is the condition of being alone with oneself, but it is not a condition of isolation from the human world. In solitude, the thinker is engaged in a kind of interior dialogue that presupposes the existence of others even in their absence. The solitary philosopher is thinking thoughts that were shaped by genuine engagement with others, and that will, if they are worth anything, eventually return to the world of other human beings. Solitude is a form of self-company that makes genuine company with others possible. Loneliness is something darker. Loneliness is the condition in which a person has been cut off from the human world so completely that even the inner resource of self-company has been destroyed. The lonely person has no reliable world, no stable reality they can count on, no others whose presence can be trusted. And this condition, she argues, is the ground on which totalitarian movements grow. The atomized, isolated individuals of modern mass society, cut off from stable communities and reliable human bonds, cut off from political institutions that would give their lives meaning and their actions consequence, are the natural constituency of totalitarian politics. The movements offer them a substitute world, a movement with iron laws and a purpose that transcends individual existence, and the lonely will accept this substitute with gratitude because any community, however lethal, seems preferable to the void of absolute isolation. This ending, with its analysis of loneliness as the social and psychological substrate of totalitarianism, points forward to everything she would write in the following decade about public life, political action, and the conditions under which a genuinely human existence can be maintained. The origins of totalitarianism is not, in her understanding, merely a historical diagnosis. It is the first movement of a larger inquiry, the necessary preparation for thinking about whether and how a different kind of political life remains possible after the worst the century had demonstrated. She was not optimistic exactly. Optimism was not a register she inhabited, but she believed, with a conviction that grew stronger rather than weaker as she worked through the problem over the following 2 decades, that thinking clearly about what had happened was itself a political act, and that the refusal to think clearly, the flight into comfortable explanations that made the catastrophe familiar and therefore manageable, was a betrayal of the obligation that surviving it had created. The category of the unprecedented is philosophically uncomfortable. It demands that we acknowledge the limits of our existing conceptual resources and build new ones rather than simply applying what we already have to a situation it was never designed to address. This demand is also, in her view, morally serious, because the alternative to acknowledging the unprecedented is to assimilate the catastrophe to familiar patterns of human failure, which carries the implication that the catastrophe was not as extreme as it was, which in turn tends to minimize both the responsibility for it and the obligation it created for subsequent political thought. Her insistence on the novelty of totalitarianism was therefore not a rhetorical gesture or a way of amplifying the horror for emotional effect. It was a philosophical position with specific political consequences. If totalitarianism was genuinely new, then the tradition of political thought that had preceded it was genuinely insufficient to prevent or respond to it, and that insufficiency needed to be examined. The examination was the work of the books that followed. The Human Condition was published in 1958 and represented the most systematic work of political philosophy Arendt would ever complete. It had its immediate origin in a series of lectures she delivered at the University of Chicago in 1956, though the thinking behind it had been accumulating for years, had been implicit in the historical analysis of her earlier work, and had been pushed forward by a question that the end of that work had posed without answering. What exactly had been destroyed when totalitarianism succeeded in reducing political communities to mechanisms of mass murder, and what kind of political life would it mean to recover? To answer that question, she went back to the beginning. She went to the ancient Greeks, to the way they had organized their understanding of human activity, and she found there a set of distinctions that she believed the Western tradition had spent 2 millennia either collapsing or confusing, distinctions she wanted to reconstruct as clearly as possible in order to show what had been lost and what the stakes of the loss actually were. The book is, in this sense, a work of philosophical archaeology. It excavates a set of concepts that have been buried under subsequent intellectual history and tries to return them to something like their original precision, not in order to restore a lost world, but in order to understand with greater clarity the world that replaced it. The book opens with an event, an object in space. Arendt begins with the launching of the Soviet satellite in 1957, the first artificial object placed in orbit around the Earth, and she uses this event as a way of introducing her central question about the modern age. The satellite was greeted by many commentators as a triumph of human ingenuity, a demonstration of the power of science and technology to extend human reach beyond the limits of the terrestrial world. But Arendt reads the reaction to the satellite launch as revealing something about the modern attitude toward human life on Earth that she finds alarming. The dream it expressed was not merely of technological achievement, but of escape, of the liberation of humanity from the conditions of earthly existence, from the constraints of a planet and a biological body. She is suspicious of this dream, and the suspicion motivates the entire book. The book's fundamental argument rests on a threefold distinction among the activities of what she calls the active life. She is distinguishing among labour, work and action, and she insists from the beginning that these are not merely different kinds of activity, but activities rooted in different aspects of the human condition, answering to different aspects of what it means to be a human being in the world, and generating different kinds of products, different kinds of relationship, and different kinds of meaning. Labour is the activity that corresponds to the biological process of the human body. It is the activity of maintaining life, of producing and consuming the things that the body requires to continue functioning. Labour is characterized above all by its cyclical, repetitive, and ultimately consumable character. What labour produces is immediately consumed and must be produced again. The bread the baker makes is eaten and must be made again. The household the cleaner maintains is dirtied and must be cleaned again. Labour is caught in the metabolism of nature, in the cycles of growth and decay that govern all biological existence, and it never escapes those cycles. What is most fundamental about labour is that it leaves no permanent trace in the world. The fruit of labour is consumed in the act of consuming it, and the world is no richer for it, no more furnished with durable objects, no more marked by the passage of individual human beings through it. Arendt is not denigrating labour or the people who perform it. She is identifying a structural feature of this kind of activity and drawing out its implications. Labour is necessary. Without it, biological life ceases. But the necessity of labour is precisely the point. It is the activity in which human beings are most fully subject to necessity, most fully at the mercy of the same metabolic processes that govern every other living creature. The labourer is not free in the performance of labour, not because anyone is forcing them to labour, but because the activity of labour is itself governed by the requirements of the body and the demands of survival, and not by the autonomous choice of the person performing it. This is why labour cannot be the foundation of a political life or a political identity. A politics organised around labour, around the satisfaction of biological needs, is a politics in which the human being appears primarily as a body requiring maintenance rather than as a person capable of action. Work is a fundamentally different kind of activity, and the distinction between them is one of the most important that the book draws. Work is the fabrication of durable objects, the making of things that outlast the process of their making, and that furnish the human world with a stability that biological nature does not provide. The table the carpenter builds is not consumed in the building of it. It persists. It stands in a room, takes up space, endures through time, and is available to be used and experienced by many different people across many generations. The cathedral the architects design and the masons construct outlasts not merely its builders, but their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The painting the artist makes, the book the writer writes, the bridge the engineers design, all of these are products of work rather than labour, because all of them add something to the world of human objects that was not there before and that persists after the person who made it has ceased to exist. The human world, in Arendt's account, is precisely this accumulation of durable objects, this fabric of things that human beings have made and that outlast individual human lives, giving those lives a context, a background, a kind of stability that biological nature does not offer. We are born into a world of objects that existed before us, and we add to that world through our work, and we leave it to those who come after us. This shared world of things is what gives human life its historical character, its capacity to have a past that is recoverable and a future that can be prepared for. And the activity that produces and maintains this world is work, the activity of the maker as distinct from the maintainer of life. But work, however important, is still not the highest activity in Arendt's ordering of the active life. Work operates within the logic of means and ends. The craftsman decides in advance what they want to make, assembles the materials and the tools, and executes a plan that was already complete in intention before it was complete in fact. The product is what matters. The process of making is subordinate to the product, and the worker can be judged by whether the product matches the intention. This logic of fabrication, as she calls it, can in principle be extended indefinitely. If the goal is to produce a certain kind of person or a certain kind of society, then the same logic of means and ends can be applied, treating persons or societies as materials to be shaped toward a predetermined form. This extension of the logic of fabrication into the political realm is, for Arendt, one of the characteristic dangers of political modernity, and it recurs in every theory that treats politics as the production of an ideal social arrangement rather than as the ongoing activity of free persons in relation to each other. Action is different from both labour and work in a way that makes it the highest and most distinctively human of the three activities. Action is activity in the realm of human affairs, in the space between persons, in the web of relationships and speech that constitutes political life. And action has characteristics that make it irreducible to any model of making or producing. It is irreversible. What has been done cannot be undone, and the consequences of action ripple out into the network of other people's actions and reactions in ways that no actor can control or predict. It is unpredictable, because action happens among a plurality of distinct human beings, each capable of their own initiatives. The consequences of any given act depend on how others respond, and others can always respond in ways that were not anticipated. And it is revelatory. In acting, a person reveals who they are in a way that cannot be achieved by any other means. The works a craftsman produces reveal their skill. The actions a person performs in the political world reveal their identity as a unique human being among other unique human beings. The condition of action is plurality, and this is one of Arendt's deepest and most original contributions to the history of political philosophy. Plurality is the fact that not man but men inhabit the earth, that human beings are not identical to each other and never will be, that each person arrives in the world as something genuinely new and unrepeatable. This plurality is not a problem to be solved by political institutions that reconcile competing interests or by philosophical systems that discover the single truth all humans share. It is the condition, the very ground of political life. Politics only exists because there are distinct human beings who can surprise each other, who can see things differently, who can begin something that no prior calculation could have produced. Aristotle had called the human being the political animal, the being who belongs in a political community, and Arendt reads this not as a merely sociological observation, not as the claim that humans are naturally social in the way that bees or ants are social, but as a philosophical claim about the specific character of human being. Human beings are political animals in Aristotle's sense because they are beings of speech as well as beings of need, because they can argue about the just and the unjust, the good and the bad, in ways that other social animals cannot. The capacity for speech about things that genuinely matter, for public deliberation among distinct persons about matters of common concern, is what makes politics in the specifically human sense possible, and what makes its absence a deprivation of something genuinely human rather than merely a social inconvenience. The failure of the modern age, in Arendt's account, is the systematic confusion of these three categories, and above all, the elevation of labour to supreme importance. Both liberal capitalism and Marxist socialism are, in her reading, labour ideologies. They understand human life fundamentally as the metabolism between the human organism and nature. They value activities in proportion to their contribution to the satisfaction of human needs, and they measure human progress by the increasing efficiency with which those needs are met. The consumer society produces individuals who understand themselves primarily as consumers. The Marxist tradition, despite its revolutionary ambitions, inherits the same fundamental assumption. Labour is the specifically human activity, and the proper goal of political organisation is the liberation of labour from the condition of exploitation. What neither tradition is capable of accounting for is the specifically political capacity that is not about satisfying needs, not about making things, not about managing the metabolism of human organisms with their natural environment, but about beginning something genuinely new in the human world together with others. This capacity is what Arendt means by action, and the story of modernity, in her reading, is largely the story of how it came to be forgotten. The forgetting has consequences that she traces with considerable specificity. When action is displaced by labour and work as the primary model for understanding human activity, the political realm tends to be reconstructed in the image of the productive enterprise. Politicians begin to speak of governing as if it were a form of management, as if the political community were a large organisation whose efficient administration was the primary political task. Policies are evaluated by their measurable outcomes, by whether they increase productivity or satisfaction or security, rather than by the quality of the political relationships they either support or undermine. The citizen is reconceived as a customer, a constituent, a beneficiary, someone to whom services are delivered, rather than someone who participates in the governance of a shared world. This reconstruction is not, in Arendt's view, a conspiracy or a deliberate choice. It is the natural outcome of a civilization that has elevated labour and work to supreme importance and has thereby lost the conceptual resources to think clearly about action, which does not fit the models of either metabolic maintenance or deliberate production. Action is irreducible to any productive logic because its defining characteristics, its irreversibility, its unpredictability, its revelatory character are precisely the characteristics that productive logic tries to eliminate in the interest of efficiency and control. The factory manager wants processes that are predictable and reversible. The craftsman wants products that match the intention. Neither model can accommodate the kind of activity in which the outcome genuinely surprises the actor, in which what is revealed is something that was not already known, in which the beginning really is a beginning rather than the execution of a predetermined plan. Politics, in Arendt's understanding, is precisely this kind of activity when it is functioning well, and the recovery of this understanding is the central task she sets for political philosophy. The political space that makes action possible has a specific character in Arendt's philosophy, and her account of it is both phenomenological and historical, both a description of a political structure and an argument about what is at stake in its presence or absence. She calls it the space of appearance, and the term is more precise than it might initially seem. The space of appearance is not a physical location. It is not a building or a plaza or any other specific architectural arrangement. It is a kind of space that comes into being wherever human beings gather together to act and speak in concert, a space that is constituted by the activity itself rather than by any prior physical arrangement. Two people who begin to deliberate together about a matter of common concern have already created, between them, a rudimentary version of this space. When their deliberation draws in others, when it generates shared action and shared speech that are visible to a broader public, the space of appearance expands and deepens. And when the acting and speaking cease, the space of appearance contracts and eventually disappears. It has no existence independent of the activity that generates it. This is why Arendt insists that political power is not a thing that can be stored, accumulated, and transferred from one holder to another like a material resource. Power, in her account, exists only as long as the people among whom it arises continue to act together. A government that retains all the formal mechanisms of authority, but has lost the active support of those it governs, retains force, perhaps, but has already lost power in the sense she means. This distinction between power and force is one of the most important and most consistently misunderstood in her entire body of work. Force is something one person or group can exercise over another through the application or threat of physical coercion. A single person with sufficient physical means can exercise force over many. But power, in Arendt's sense, cannot be exercised by a single person alone, because power is not a property of individuals, but of groups acting in concert. The difference appears most clearly in moments of political crisis, when a government that has lost its power discovers that its force is insufficient to sustain it. The machinery of coercion can compel compliance, but cannot generate the legitimacy that genuine political power requires, and without legitimacy, even a well-armed government is in a condition of permanent political fragility. This has a deeply important implication for how she understands political institutions. A perfectly designed constitution, a beautifully balanced set of governmental structures, a comprehensive legal framework. All of these can create conditions that favour the space of appearance, can protect it, and give it a stable form in which it can persist over time. But they cannot substitute for the political activity that generates the space of appearance in the first place. The space of appearance depends on people actually acting and speaking in public, actually engaging with each other as distinct human beings with particular views and particular identities, and if that activity ceases, the space of appearance vanishes even if all the institutional forms remain intact. An empty parliament, a government of administrators rather than politicians, a public sphere reduced to the management of opinion. These represent the decay of the space of appearance, the survival of its housing after its life has gone. She reads the ancient Greek city-state through this lens, but not in the way that romanticizers of classical antiquity typically read it. She is not nostalgic for a specific historical arrangement or for the social conditions of the ancient world, many of which she acknowledged were morally appalling, built as they were on a foundation of slavery and on the systematic exclusion of women from political life. What she draws from the Greek experience is not a blueprint, but a model, a set of conceptual distinctions that allow her to see the difference between activities and to evaluate what is at stake when one replaces another. The city-state, as she reads it, was organized around the idea that great deeds and great words deserve to be remembered, that the proper function of political life was to create a space in which excellence could appear and be preserved from the oblivion that overtakes everything else. The city was a form of organized remembrance, a structure whose primary purpose was to give permanence to the deeds and speeches of those who acted within it, and in doing so, to give meaning to those deeds and speeches that they could not generate for themselves. The concept of natality that she introduces in the human condition is one of the most philosophically original contributions in her entire body of work. It requires some care to state precisely, because it has been both invoked enthusiastically and misunderstood frequently. Natality is not simply the fact of birth in the biological sense. It is the political and philosophical significance of the fact of birth, the meaning that the structure of birth has for our understanding of what human beings are and what they are capable of doing in the world. The concept is developed explicitly as a response to a philosophical tradition that had organized its understanding of human existence around the opposite fact, the fact of death. In the most influential philosophy of existence of the 20th century, the understanding of human life is organized around the horizon of mortality. It is the awareness of death, in that framework, that individuates the human being, that strips away the anonymous familiarity of everyday life and forces the individual to confront the irreducible particularity of their own existence. The resolution of this confrontation is supposed to be the authentic life, the life lived with full awareness of its finitude and therefore with full seriousness about the choices it makes. Death is the absolute that gives urgency and structure to everything else. Arendt does not deny the importance of death, and she is not offering a philosophy of existence from which the darker facts have been sanitized away. What she insists on is that birth is equally fundamental, and that the philosophical tradition's emphasis on death has come at the cost of an adequate account of what birth means for political life. Every human being arrives in the world as something new. This is not merely a biological observation, but a philosophical claim of the first importance. Each birth represents the arrival of a new beginning, a new point of initiation from which actions that no prior conditions could have fully determined will proceed. The fact of birth is the ontological ground of action in her account because it is in our nature as beings who have been born, as beings who have arrived in the world as new beginnings, that we have the capacity to begin. She drew the conceptual expression of this idea from her reading of Augustine, from the phrase she had worked with since her doctoral dissertation, that a beginning be made, man was created. The political meaning of birth is that it introduces into the world a being that is inherently capable of initiating, of starting something new, of introducing into the causal chain of the world an act that was not contained in what came before it. This idea has several layers. At the simplest level, it means that human beings are naturally capable of initiative, of doing something unexpected, of surprising the world because they partake in the character of beginnings. At a deeper level, it means that the political condition is fundamentally open rather than closed, that the future is not simply an extension of the past, that even in the darkest historical situations, the possibility of a new beginning is not in principle extinguished. This is not optimism in any shallow sense. Arendt had no patience for optimism that did not reckon with the full scale of what had happened in her century. It was rather a philosophical insistence that the character of human existence as natal, as organized around birth and beginning, rather than simply around death and ending, means that the future always contains more possibility than any calculation based on the present can capture. The loss of world is the third great theme of the second half of The Human Condition, and it represents her diagnosis of what has specifically happened to modern political life. The human world, she has established, is the web of durable objects and relationships that mediates between human beings and gives them something in common. It is both the physical world of things and the institutional world of laws, customs, traditions, and political forms. When the human world is functioning well, it performs a double service simultaneously. It separates human beings from each other, giving each person a distinct position from which to see things in their own way, and it connects them, providing a common ground on which those different perspectives can meet and engage. The table at which people sit together separates them, giving each a distinct place, while also connecting them, providing the surface around which they gather in common. This image of the table, which she uses explicitly, is a model of what the world as such does for human beings at the political level. It makes possible both individual perspective and common ground. What Arendt diagnoses as the characteristic failure of modern political life is the collapse of this world and its replacement by what she calls the social. The social is not the political and not the private, but a hybrid that has colonized both, governed by the norms of conformity and administration rather than by the dynamics of genuine political action. The social is the realm of the household economy writ large, of the nation-state conceived as a giant housekeeping enterprise whose primary task is the management of the life process of its population, the provision of welfare, the management of economic cycles, the administration of populations who are understood primarily as bearers of needs rather than as actors capable of genuine political initiative. When the political is replaced by the social, the conditions of genuine action are progressively destroyed. Social life requires conformity. It expects individuals to behave according to statistical norms, to fulfill the roles that the social order assigns them, to satisfy demands that the system can predict and plan for. It has no place for the unpredictable, irreversible beginning that is the essence of political action. The social person does not act, they behave. And the distinction between action and behavior, between what a free person does and what a conditioned organism does, is for Arendt the distinction between a genuinely political existence and one that has been reduced to mere process. She was writing this analysis in the late 1950s in the United States, in the period of post-war prosperity and Cold War conformism, and her contemporaries who read the human condition carefully felt its specific polemical weight. The administrative welfare state and the consumer economy had between them produced, in her reading, a population of labourers who consumed and a government of administrators who managed, and the space between them in which genuine politics had once been possible was growing steadily smaller. She did not romanticize any period as one in which this space had been fully or adequately realized. She knew that the Greek polis had excluded the majority of its residents from political life, and she knew that the American Republic had been built on slavery. But she insisted that the question of whether the space of appearance could be sustained and enlarged was the central political question of the modern age, and that a political philosophy that could not pose this question clearly had already conceded too much to the forces that were eliminating it. The human condition ends without a conclusion in the ordinary sense, without a program or a set of recommendations that would tell the reader what to do with the analysis it has provided. This has sometimes been read as a failure of nerve, as an unwillingness to follow through on the implications of an argument that had identified genuine and serious problems with modern political life. Arendt was unmoved by this criticism. She believed that the task of political philosophy was not to produce programs, but to produce clarity, and that clarity about the nature of action, plurality, natality, and the space of appearance was itself a contribution to political life, even without a program attached to it. People who understand what is at stake in the preservation of the public realm are better equipped to act in its defense than people who do not. And the understanding cannot be condensed into a program without losing precisely the features that make it philosophically serious. She was also, in a deeper sense, committed to the open-endedness that action requires. A political philosophy that concluded with a program for the correct organization of political life would be, in its own terms, a form of the fabrication logic she had criticized, the attempt to produce a predetermined outcome rather than to sustain the conditions in which genuinely unpredictable new beginnings remain possible. The book's openness at its close is, in this reading, not a failure but a consistency. It leaves the reader not with instructions, but with a sharpened understanding of what is at stake, and trusts them to act on that understanding in ways that cannot be anticipated in advance. This trust in the reader, in the capacity of the person who has genuinely thought through the argument to act on it with the freedom and the responsibility that action requires, is itself an expression of the philosophy the human condition had set out to articulate. In the spring of 1961, Hannah Arendt travelled to Jerusalem to cover a criminal trial for the New Yorker magazine, and what she witnessed there and wrote about in the years that followed would change the trajectory of her reputation, strain friendships that had survived decades, generate a controversy that reached into every corner of the Jewish intellectual world and well beyond it, and produce a philosophical concept that has outlasted almost all of the arguments made against it. The trial was that of Adolf Eichmann, an SS lieutenant colonel who had served as one of the chief administrative officers responsible for the logistics of the deportation of Jews to the death camps during the Second World War. After the German defeat, Eichmann had escaped to Argentina under a false name, living quietly in Buenos Aires for more than a decade under the identity of a German worker named Ricardo Clement. Israeli intelligence agents identified him in 1960, abducted him from a street near his home in May of that year, and brought him clandestinely to Israel to stand trial. He was the first person to be tried in Israel under the Nazis and Nazi collaborators' punishment law, which had been passed in 1950 with exactly this kind of case in mind. The trial opened in Jerusalem on the 11th of April, 1961. The decision to stage the trial in Jerusalem rather than before an international tribunal raised questions that Arendt felt bound to address directly, and that many in the Jewish community felt she had no business raising at all. David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli Prime Minister who had authorized the abduction, was explicit in his public statements about the political purposes of the proceedings. The trial was to educate a generation of Israelis who had not experienced the Holocaust directly, to establish Israel's standing as the legitimate representative of the Jewish people, and to assert before the world that crimes against Jews would be answered by Jewish justice. These were not entirely illegitimate goals, but Arendt argued that they made the trial into something other than what a trial properly is: a legal proceeding in which an individual is tried for specific charges on the basis of evidence by judges applying legal standards that are independent of the political purposes the proceedings might serve. The chief prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, opened the proceedings with a theatrical address of great rhetorical power, speaking as the voice of the 6 million murdered Jews, calling the dead to bear witness through him to the living court. Arendt was disturbed by this framing. She respected the emotional force of Hausner's opening and did not doubt the sincerity of his grief. But she felt that the staging of the trial as a historical pageant in which Eichmann functioned as the representative figure of Nazi evil rather than as an individual defendant being tried for specific acts, violated the judicial purpose that alone could give the proceedings genuine moral authority. The parade of witnesses who testified about their experiences during the Holocaust, while compelling as human testimony, was often only tangentially related to the specific charges against Eichmann. She did not dispute that their suffering deserved to be heard. She disputed that a criminal trial was the right venue for hearing it, and she found the blurring of the distinction between a tribunal and a historical pageant troubling in ways she believed went beyond aesthetic preference. There was also the question of jurisdiction, which she raised with a directness that many readers found provocative. Eichmann's crimes had been committed against European Jews, not Israeli citizens, in a period before the State of Israel existed. The principle that a state may try any person for crimes against humanity, regardless of where those crimes were committed and regardless of the nationality of either defendant or victims, was by 1961 an accepted principle of international law following the Nuremberg trials. But the specific application of this principle by a state that had not existed at the time of the crimes against a defendant who had never had any relationship with that state, and in circumstances that had required an act of international abduction, raised questions about the boundaries of legitimate legal authority that she believed deserved more serious treatment than they had received in the legal arguments surrounding the trial. These were the arguments she made in print, but they were not the arguments that generated the greatest controversy. What generated the controversy was what she wrote about Eichmann himself. She attended the trial's opening weeks in Jerusalem and observed the defendant closely through the sessions she was present for, reading the transcripts and documentation of those she missed. Eichmann sat in a glass booth, visible to the courtroom but acoustically separated from it, wearing headphones through which the proceedings were translated into German. He was a slight balding man in his mid-50s, with an unremarkable face and an air of careful attentiveness that seemed, on closer observation, somehow mechanical. He took notes. He conferred with his attorney. He answered questions from the prosecutors with a precision that was sometimes pedantic, sometimes transparently evasive, and sometimes, disturbingly, entirely candid, offering details about his administrative role that his attorney would clearly have preferred he had omitted. He also spoke almost entirely in clichés. Arendt was struck by this with a force that grew stronger as the days went on. Eichmann did not seem to originate sentences so much as to reproduce them, drawing on a stock of bureaucratic and official formulations that he deployed with apparent conviction, but that could not have been evidence of genuine conviction because they contradicted each other and were adapted to whatever explanatory purpose was immediately at hand. He described himself as a man who had carried out orders, a man who had no authority to do otherwise, a man who had personally opposed the violence while efficiently carrying out his assigned administrative role. He spoke of himself as a small man in a large machine, which was true in some organizational sense, while simultaneously taking evident pride in the efficiency with which he had performed his functions, which was also true and sat uneasily with the first claim. His lawyer tried repeatedly to redirect him when he ventured into these contradictions, and Eichmann, with genuine obtuseness, kept venturing back into them. What struck Arendt most forcefully, with a force that was difficult to articulate to readers who had not been in that courtroom, was what she did not see. She had expected, without fully articulating the expectation, some form of the demonic. She had expected someone whose appearance or manner would convey something of the enormity of the deeds he had organized, someone in whose face or bearing she could locate a motivation adequate to the crime. What she found instead was a man who seemed, in the most genuinely bewildering sense, shallow, not harmless, not unimportant, but shallow in the specific philosophical sense, without the kind of depth that in ordinary life we associate with genuine agency, with genuine interiority, with a person who has thought about what they are and what they are doing. The section of her book that caused the greatest initial uproar was not in fact her description of Eichmann's ordinariness, but her discussion of the Jewish councils, the administrative bodies that the Nazi authorities had required Jewish communities to establish in the occupied territories, and that had, under extreme and impossible coercion, sometimes cooperated in the logistical management of deportations. She discussed this briefly and based her discussion on the historical record that was already available by the early 1960s. Many of her critics read this brief discussion as an accusation of complicity or collaboration, as a suggestion that Jewish leadership bore some share of responsibility for the deaths of the people they had been coerced into administering. This was not her argument. Her argument was that the situation of the councils revealed the structure of totalitarian domination at its extreme, the systematic attempt to destroy the moral person by making genuine moral choice impossible, by creating conditions in which any action, including inaction, could be converted into participation in the machinery of murder. But the distinction between describing the conditions of moral impossibility and accusing the people trapped in those conditions of moral failure was lost in the heat of the controversy, and the accusation against her became a fixed feature of the book's reception that she spent years trying to correct. The book she published, Eichmann in Jerusalem appeared first as a 5-part series in The New Yorker in early 1963, and then as a book later that same year. The response was extraordinary in its intensity. She was accused of lacking compassion for the murdered, of approaching the Holocaust with a cold irony inappropriate to its subject. She was accused of misrepresenting the historical evidence about Eichmann's actual ideology, of distorting her observation to fit a preconceived thesis, of writing with a tone of superiority toward both the victims and the survivors that was morally incomprehensible given her own history. The most painful of these accusations came from Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism and one of the most distinguished Jewish intellectuals of the century. Scholem published an open letter in which he accused Arendt of lacking what he called love of the Jewish people, of writing about the trial and about Jewish experience in the Holocaust, with a cold irony that he found morally incomprehensible in someone of her background and her history. The tone of the book, he argued, was heartless, and heartlessness toward the Jewish dead was a moral failing that no intellectual achievement could compensate for. Arendt replied directly and without the softening that the situation might have seemed to demand. She did not love peoples, she said. She loved only particular individual persons, and she was not willing to pretend otherwise. The kind of collective love that Scholem was demanding, the love of the Jewish people as a political sentiment, was a form of tribalism that she did not share and did not consider herself obligated to share, and she would not adopt it even in the face of the accusation that her refusal constituted a moral failing. She also noted, with measured acidity, that Scholem had not engaged with any of her specific historical or legal arguments, had not pointed to any factual error in her account of the trial, but had instead accused her of an emotional deficiency. She did not think that emotional solidarity was an adequate substitute for the historical and philosophical engagement the trial had demanded, and she did not think his failure to engage with those questions was a form of love that deserved her deference. The rupture marked by this exchange was never fully repaired. Other friendships survived the controversy or were strained but not broken. Mary McCarthy defended her publicly in print with a tenacity that required its own intellectual courage, exposing herself to the same accusations of insensitivity. Hans Jonas disagreed with some of Arendt's conclusions, but continued to engage with them as arguments rather than dismissing them as evidence of moral failure. Her friendship with Kurt Blumenfeld, an old companion from her Zionist period in Germany, was damaged and never fully recovered. These distinctions between those who engaged the argument and those who rejected it without engagement were not, Arendt thought, incidental. They were themselves a demonstration of the difference between thinking and not thinking that was at the heart of everything the Eichmann case had raised for her. The controversy over Eichmann in Jerusalem did not resolve itself within Arendt's lifetime, and it has not resolved itself since. The specific historical question of whether her characterization of Eichmann as an essentially thoughtless functionary rather than a committed ideological anti-Semite was accurate became a point of sustained scholarly debate in the decades after her death, when historians working with newly available documentary archives found evidence suggesting that Eichmann had a more developed ideological commitment than she had been able to establish from the trial record alone. Some scholars argued that this evidence undermined her portrait of him as characterized primarily by the absence of thought rather than by the presence of ideological conviction. Others argued that the two accounts were not mutually exclusive, that ideological commitment and the specific kind of thoughtlessness she described could coexist in the same person, that the point of her analysis was not to establish what Eichmann privately believed, but to describe the mode of his functioning, the way in which his beliefs, whatever they were, operated without the self-reflective examination that would have made them genuinely his own in the moral sense. The philosophical question the controversy raised has proved more durable and more productive than the historical one. The relationship between individual moral responsibility and institutional participation in collective harm, the question of how a person can be held accountable for what they do within a system whose full operations are not visible from their position within it, has become one of the central questions of moral philosophy and legal theory in the decades since Arendt first posed it in the particular and disturbing form the Jerusalem courtroom had provided. She did not resolve this question. She forced it into view with a precision it had not previously had, and the forcing of it into view was a contribution to moral understanding that the acrimony of the reception could not in the end diminish. The phrase appears as the subtitle of the book, not in its body, a report on the banality of evil. Arendt used it sparingly in the text itself, most prominently in the closing pages of the epilogue. She chose it because it described, as precisely as she could manage in a few words, the quality she had observed in Eichmann and in the phenomenon he represented. And for the rest of her life, she was compelled to explain again and again, in letters and lectures, and in the final work she would not finish, what it did not mean, because what it was taken to mean by many of its most vehement critics was almost the opposite of what she had intended. She did not mean that the Holocaust was banal. She did not mean that evil is ordinary in the sense of being easily produced by the normal pressures of social conformity. She did not mean that the men who organized and carried out mass murder were, underneath the uniforms and the bureaucratic titles, simply people like everyone else who had made understandable choices under pressure. She did not mean that the difference between a murderer and a bystander is trivial, or that anyone in the same institutional position as Eichmann would have done the same thing, or that the structures of bureaucratic organization automatically produce moral blindness in all who work within them. The phrase does not mean any of these things, and the interpretive tradition that has attributed these meanings to it has, Arendt argued persistently, misread a precise philosophical observation as a sociological generalization it was never meant to be. What she did mean is both narrower and more disturbing than any of these misreadings. She meant that Eichmann's evil was characterized by a specific deficiency, a deficiency that was not stupidity, not ignorance, not ordinary moral weakness, and not the ideological fanaticism that most people, herself initially included, had expected to find. The deficiency was what she called thoughtlessness, and by this she meant something philosophically precise rather than colloquially dismissive. She did not mean that Eichmann was unintelligent in the ordinary sense. He was not unintelligent. He had organized enormously complex logistical operations across a continent at war, had navigated the Byzantine internal politics of a murderous bureaucracy with considerable skill, and had demonstrated in his testimony a memory and an attention to administrative detail that were remarkable by any standard. He was not stupid. What he lacked in her account was the kind of thinking that requires a person to stop, to stand back from the immediate demands of the role they are performing, and to ask what that role actually consists of in terms that are not entirely internal to the institutional framework defining the role. He operated entirely within the vocabulary, the categories, and the norms of the system he worked within, and he applied them with remarkable consistency and efficiency without ever stepping back from that system to ask what the system was for from a standpoint external to it. There was no gap, as far as she could discern, between the person and the role, no interior distance from which the role could be examined or questioned. He had become, in the deepest possible sense, his function. The philosophical roots of this analysis run through Kant in a direction that is not immediately obvious, and Arendt was at pains to trace this connection carefully because it was through Kant that she believed the concept could be given its fullest philosophical justification. She had been working on Kant's moral philosophy for years, and she read his Critique of Judgment, the great work on aesthetic experience and its relationship to moral life, as containing resources that the moral philosophy itself had failed to develop. The critique of pure reason had given Western philosophy its account of theoretical knowledge. The critique of practical reason had given it its moral law, and the critique of judgment had given it something that neither of the preceding two could provide: an account of a kind of judgment that applies to particular cases without deriving from universal rules, that claims validity without demonstrable certainty, and that requires a specific mental capacity she found politically indispensable. This capacity, which Kant associated with the aesthetic judge who says, "This is beautiful," rather than merely, "I like this," requires what he called an enlarged mentality, the capacity to think from the standpoint of others, to take into account perspectives other than one's own in forming a judgment. The person who genuinely exercises this capacity is not simply reporting their own immediate response. They are imagining how the thing being judged appears from the perspectives of many different observers and arriving at an assessment that takes those standpoints genuinely into account. This is not the same as agreeing with everyone or refusing to take a position. It is rather the capacity to form a position that has been genuinely tested against other possible positions, a position that one holds knowing what it looks like from the outside. This capacity for representative thinking is, in Arendt's reading, not merely an aesthetic achievement. It is also a moral one, and the connection between the two is not accidental but deep. The person who is genuinely capable of thinking from the standpoint of others has the cognitive equipment to resist the worst moral failures of institutional conformity, because they can recognize that the values embedded in their institutional role are not the only values available, that other human perspectives exist, and that the meaning of what they are doing looks different from those other perspectives than it looks from within the role they occupy. This is not a guarantee of good behavior. There is no such guarantee. But it is the cognitive and moral precondition of anything that could count as genuine moral agency. Anything that could count as a choice rather than a mere execution of institutional instruction. Eichmann, by this analysis, was not capable of representative thinking in this sense. He could not think from the standpoint of the people he was organizing for deportation. He could not imagine the perspective of someone standing on the other side of the bureaucratic transaction he was managing. He apparently did not notice this incapacity because the institutional world in which he operated did not require this kind of thinking, and indeed systematically discouraged it. The system rewarded efficiency, loyalty, and the subordination of personal scruples to institutional imperatives. The one thing it could not accommodate was the kind of thinking that stepped outside the system's categories to ask what the system was doing from a standpoint external to the system itself. The misreadings of the phrase have been, in their way, historically instructive. The most common misreading, which generated the most influential secondary literature, treated banality of evil as a sociological claim. A claim about how ordinary people under institutional pressure become perpetrators, about the ease with which normal individuals can be transformed into participants in atrocity. Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments in the early 1960s were conducted partly in response to the question the Eichmann trial raised, and the results, in which a substantial proportion of ordinary American subjects administered what they believed to be painful electric shocks to strangers when instructed to do so by an authority figure, were widely read as an empirical confirmation of Arendt's thesis. Arendt herself was ambivalent about this reading. The experiments were interesting, but they demonstrated something somewhat different from what she had observed in Eichmann. They demonstrated the power of authority to override immediate moral discomfort, not the specific failure of thinking she had identified in him. Her analysis connects to her final philosophical work in ways that are not always recognized. After the Eichmann controversy, she returned with new urgency to the question of what thinking actually is and what it does, and she found in Socrates the model she needed. Socrates, in her reading, was the first philosopher to make thinking itself a political issue by demonstrating that the capacity to examine one's own opinions was not a merely intellectual exercise, but a moral and political one. The unexamined life, in his famous formulation, was not worth living, and this was not merely a comment on the quality of the unlived life, but a claim about its moral status, about what it means to be a person who can be held responsible for what they do. The Socratic two-in-one is what she is reaching toward in the analysis of Eichmann's thoughtlessness. What Eichmann had extinguished, or had perhaps never fully developed, was precisely this inner dialogue, the capacity of the self to take distance from its own positions and submit them to questioning, to argue with itself, to be genuinely uncertain about things that the institutional role required certainty about. Without this inner dialogue, without this internal plurality of perspective within the individual mind, the external plurality of perspectives that other people represent becomes invisible. The person who cannot argue with themselves has no resources for genuinely hearing the argument of another, for genuinely taking it in as something more than noise to be overcome. This is also why she came to insist, against the most common misreading, that the issue was not about Eichmann's ordinariness in the sociological sense. She was not saying that anyone in his position would have done what he did. She was saying that what he did was made possible by a specific failure of thinking, a failure that could be cultivated or avoided, that was not biologically given, but was in some degree a condition that individuals and institutions contribute to producing or preventing. The prevention of the kind of evil Eichmann represented is, in this account, in some degree a matter of educational and political cultivation, of the development of the capacity for genuine self-examination and representative thinking that bureaucratic efficiency systematically discourages. This is a disturbing conclusion, not because it makes evil seem easy to prevent, but because it makes the cultivation of the conditions for good judgment a permanent political responsibility rather than a problem that can be solved once and filed away. She was careful never to say that thinking makes a person good. She acknowledged explicitly that thinking could produce nihilism as easily as moral insight, that the Socratic practice of questioning was no guarantee of anything except that the questions had been asked. But thinking, she believed, was the necessary condition for the possibility of genuine moral judgment, the capacity without which judgment was replaced by mere role performance, and the cultivation of this capacity was therefore not a luxury of the philosophical life, but a political necessity. The banality of evil was, in the end, a warning about what becomes possible when this cultivation fails. Not more violence necessarily, but more systematic, more administratively efficient, and more capable of proceeding without the personal engagement with what the destruction means that has historically been the last imperfect break on the worst human capacities. The phrase has also been misunderstood as applying to evil generally, as a claim about the nature of evil wherever it appears, rather than as a description of a particular kind of evil that appeared in a particular historical form. She was not making a metaphysical claim about evil as such. The theological tradition had long argued about whether evil was a positive force or merely an absence of good, and Arendt was not intervening in that debate. She was making a phenomenological observation about a specific kind of perpetrator who appeared for the first time in modern bureaucratic systems of mass murder. The perpetrator who kills not from cruelty, not from fanaticism, not from ideological conviction fully inhabited, but from a perfectly consistent application of administrative procedures to whatever category of persons the system requires to be eliminated. This figure had not existed, at least not in this specific form, before the 20th century produced the bureaucratic conditions that made it possible. This is also why she insisted that the concept was not generalizable to every instance of moral failure. The ordinary criminal who steals or assaults from selfishness or anger is not a case of the banality of evil in her sense. The ideological fanatic who kills from the fullness of a deeply held conviction about racial purity or historical necessity is not, on her analysis, banal in this sense either, because the fanaticism is a form of intense, if perverse, engagement with the question of what one is doing and why. The banal, in her technical usage, is something more specific and more philosophically troubling. The complete absence of this engagement, the unreflective execution of function, the perfect substitution of institutional role for personal conscience. It was this specific configuration that she had found in Eichmann, and it was this specific configuration that the phrase was coined to describe. The concept, properly understood, does not comfort. The comfortable reading, the reading that says evil is ordinary and that all of us are therefore perpetrators waiting for the right conditions, is in some ways less disturbing than the reading Arendt actually intended. If evil is simply what ordinary people do under institutional pressure, then no particular cultivated effort is required of any individual to avoid it, because the individual is not really the relevant unit of moral analysis. The institutional pressure is what matters, and the solution is institutional reform. Arendt's actual analysis is more demanding. It says that the capacity for thinking, for the inner dialogue that holds open the space between a person and their institutional role, is something that requires active cultivation, that can be allowed to atrophy, that can be deliberately or inadvertently discouraged by the environments in which people live and work. This means that the moral question of who we will be in the face of institutional pressure is not resolved in advance by the pressure itself, but remains, throughout the life of the person, a question that their choices and their habits of mind are continuously answering. This is a more burdensome conclusion than the sociological reading allows. But it is also, she believed, a more honest one. On Revolution appeared in 1963, in the same season as Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the two books together made that year the most turbulent and consequential of Arendt's public life. Where Eichmann in Jerusalem generated outrage, On Revolution generated argument of a different and in some ways more productive kind, because it engaged directly with questions about the meaning of modern political life that the left and the liberal centre had been debating for decades without arriving at any settled conclusions. Arendt's intervention was characteristically oblique. She entered the debate not through its contemporary terms, but through a comparative historical analysis of the two great revolutions of the 18th century, the American and the French, and what she argued about the difference between them was received as simultaneously illuminating and deeply unsettling. The argument begins with a distinction that seems obvious once it is stated, but that she contends had been systematically obscured in modern political thought. Freedom and liberation are not the same thing. Liberation is the release from something, from oppression, from poverty, from the rule of an unjust power. It is a negative condition defined by what it removes rather than by what it creates. Freedom is the possession of something, the positive capacity to act in a public realm alongside others, to participate in the governance of a common life, to take part in the kind of political action she had analysed in the human condition. These two things are not only different but can come into conflict, and when they do, the conflict tends to resolve in favour of liberation at the expense of freedom. The liberation of a population from oppression does not automatically produce the freedom of that population to govern themselves. It produces instead a political vacuum that is filled by whatever force is strongest in the moment of liberation, and if that force has not thought carefully about the institutional conditions of freedom, liberation has merely exchanged one form of unfreedom for another. The French Revolution, in Arendt's account, is the definitive modern example of this resolution gone wrong. The revolution that began in 1789 with genuine aspirations to political freedom, to the establishment of a republic in which citizens could participate in meaningful self-governance, was within a few years overwhelmed by the force of what she calls the social question, the massive poverty of the French population, the suffering of the majority of human beings in France who lived in conditions of deprivation so extreme that their suffering could not be kept out of the political realm, even by those who understood, or thought they understood, the dangers of confusing political and economic questions. The leaders of the French Revolution were not unaware of the risk. They had read the ancient histories, had studied the Roman Republic and the Greek city-states, had aspired to a politics of freedom modelled on the classical examples. But they faced a population whose most immediate and overwhelming reality was not political exclusion, but physical suffering, and the suffering demanded to be heard. When it entered the political realm with the full force of mass misery behind it, it transformed the character of the revolution in ways that none of its leaders fully controlled. Robespierre and the revolutionary government of the Jacobins are the figures through whom Arendt traces this transformation. They did not set out to create a reign of terror. They set out to make the revolution answer to the needs of the neediest, to bring into political consideration the masses of France who had previously had no voice. And in doing so, she argues, they transformed the driving principle of political action from the pursuit of freedom to the relief of suffering, from the establishment of institutions to the satisfaction of urgent needs, from the patient and procedural work of political construction to the passionate and absolute demand of compassionate urgency. The logic of compassion, when it becomes the driving principle of political action, operates very differently from the logic of justice. Compassion for suffering is immediate, urgent, and intolerant of delay. It cannot be mediated by argument because argument is slow and suffering is now. It cannot be limited by law because law is procedural and suffering demands results rather than procedures. It cannot tolerate the expressions of competing interests that are the normal and necessary stuff of political deliberation, because those expressions seem like so many obstacles between the suffering masses and their relief. The guillotine, in this reading, is the end point of a logic rather than merely an expression of individual cruelty. It is what political action looks like when the passion of absolute compassion has eliminated the procedural patience that genuine republican government requires. The American Revolution, in Arendt's reading, was able to avoid this fate because it operated under conditions that allowed it to keep the social question at the margins of political deliberation. The North American colonies of the late 18th century did not have a population of the destitute in the French sense. There was poverty in colonial America, and there was the enormous and terrible institution of slavery, which Arendt acknowledges without fully integrating into her argument, but the majority of the free population was not living in the condition of extreme deprivation that would have demanded the revolution's immediate attention. This meant that the founders could focus on what she considers the genuinely political question: how to establish a new political body, a republic with institutions capable of sustaining genuine political freedom, without being overwhelmed by the pressure of social misery demanding immediate relief. She reads the deliberations at the Constitutional Convention and the subsequent debates over ratification as genuine achievements in the history of political thought, moments in which human beings actually confronted the problem of establishing political authority anew, without being able to appeal to tradition or divine right or any other established source of legitimacy. What the founders discovered in this confrontation was that the authority of the new political order could be grounded not in any prior source external to the political community, but in the act of political founding itself, in the mutual commitment of a community of persons to a set of institutions through the act of deliberation and consent. This is the meaning of the phrase in the preamble to the Constitution, "We, the people." Not a natural fact, but a political achievement, an act of self-constitution by a community that was creating itself through the very act of constitutional deliberation. She attends particularly to the role of the concept of authority in the founding. and her account of how the American founders derived authority from the act of founding itself rather than from tradition or divine sanction is one of the most original sections of the book. The paradox she identifies is this: every act of founding requires authority to be legitimate, but authority cannot be derived from the founding act itself without circularity. The founders of Rome had resolved this paradox by treating the act of founding as itself sacred, as inaugurating a tradition that could then be augmented but never broken. The American founders replicated this structure in secular form, treating the Constitution not as a product of the founding moment that could be discarded or replaced, but as a foundation whose authority grew rather than diminished with time, a document that bound subsequent generations not by force but by the accumulated weight of its authority. Thomas Jefferson, Arendt argues, was the one member of the founding generation who most clearly recognized the problem that this created. If the authority of the political order depended on the founding moment, and if subsequent generations were bound by that moment without having participated in it, then each new generation was, in effect, ruled by the dead, governed by decisions made before their birth, and therefore without their consent. Jefferson's various proposals for constitutional renovation, including his suggestion that constitutions should expire every generation so that each new generation could give its own consent to the institutions it lived under, were never adopted, and the American constitutional order developed instead in ways that preserved the founding document while restricting the possibilities for genuine constitutional recreation. His proposal for ward republics, smaller political units below the level of the county, that would give ordinary citizens genuine political experience in settings where their participation would be meaningful rather than merely symbolic, was similarly ignored. But Arendt takes this proposal seriously as evidence that Jefferson understood what was at stake in the question of political participation, understood that representative government by itself could not sustain the political spirit that the revolution had expressed, and was searching for institutions that would make genuine participatory politics possible in a country too large for the direct democracy of the ancient city-state. The revolutionary treasure, a phrase she borrows from the French poet René Char, who had written about the experience of political engagement in the resistance during the German occupation, is what the American founders had momentarily grasped and what the subsequent history of American politics had progressively lost. The treasure was not the constitutional documents, important as they were. It was the experience itself, the experience of acting in concert with others around matters of genuine common concern, of discovering in that action a kind of freedom and a kind of power that are available in no other form. This experience had been available to the founders, briefly and partially, during the revolutionary period. It had appeared again in Arendt's reading in the council formations that had emerged spontaneously in various revolutionary situations in European history, in the sections of the Paris Commune of 1871, in the workers' councils that appeared in Russia in 1917 before being dissolved by the Bolshevik party apparatus, in the revolutionary councils that appeared in Germany and Hungary in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. These councils, which Arendt discusses with evident enthusiasm as evidence of a recurring political impulse toward genuine participatory self-governance, were in her account not the products of ideological design, but the spontaneous creations of people who had, in the moment of political crisis, discovered the experience of acting in concert and found it to be something worth preserving. That the councils had always been defeated by the more organised forces of party politics, or state power did not for her demonstrate that they were utopian or unrealisable as a permanent form. It demonstrated that the forces arrayed against genuinely participatory politics, the forces of administrative efficiency and ideological organisation, were powerful, and that preserving spaces of genuine political action in the modern world required a deliberate commitment to doing so rather than an expectation that such spaces would emerge or persist on their own. On Revolution was received by the academic left with a mixture of interest and resistance that was somewhat different in character from the outrage the Eichmann book generated. The argument about the French Revolution was read, not entirely unfairly, as an implicit critique of Marxist revolutionary politics and of the tradition that had followed from it. Her insistence on the distinction between political freedom and the social question was seen by many as a way of insulating political institutions from economic critique, of treating questions of material deprivation as somehow outside the sphere of legitimate political concern. Arendt did not accept this reading. She was not arguing that poverty was politically irrelevant. She was arguing that a politics organized entirely around the relief of poverty, in which the imperative of compassionate urgency displaces the patient construction of institutions of freedom, tends to produce forms of political organization that achieve neither justice nor freedom, but only the exchange of one form of domination for another. The history she had lived through gave her considerable grounds for this concern. On Revolution is, in several respects, the most directly political of her major works, in the sense of being the one most immediately addressed to questions of political design and political practice, rather than to the philosophical foundations of political thinking. And it is the work in which her own commitments are most clearly visible, a commitment to genuine political participation, to the preservation of spaces in which human beings act in concert rather than merely administering each other, and to the recovery of what the revolutionary tradition had discovered and then lost. She was not a nostalgist. She was not proposing to restore any historical form of political life. But she believed that the revolutionary experience, the experience of persons who had genuinely created new political realities through the power of their concerted action, was a resource that could be thought about and understood, and that the thinking and understanding were themselves politically valuable. The book ends implicitly with a question that she believed the political theory of her era had not adequately addressed: whether the modern mass society, with its enormous scale, its administrative complexity, and its tendency to reduce political participation to the periodic selection of representatives, could sustain genuine political freedom, and what kind of institutional innovation would be required to preserve the space of appearance in conditions that were so different from those in which it had historically flourished. She could not answer this question, but she could pose it with a clarity that required anyone who read the book carefully to recognize that the question was genuinely open, and that the failure to pose it seriously was itself a political choice, with consequences that the next century would have ample opportunity to discover. The Eichmann case had left Arendt with a question she could not set aside. She had encountered a man who had organized the logistics of mass murder, and who appeared on the evidence of everything she had observed and read to have done so without thinking, without engaging in any form of the self-reflective, self-interrogating activity that she associated with genuine mental life. The question the encounter posed was not simply about Eichmann. It was about thinking itself, about what thinking actually is, about what it does and fails to do, about the relationship between the capacity for thought and the capacity for moral judgment. This question, she knew, was not separable from the oldest questions of philosophy, the questions that Plato and Aristotle had asked about the faculties of the soul and their relationship to the good life, and answering it adequately would require a systematic inquiry that her previous work had not undertaken. She was invited to deliver the Gifford Lectures at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland in 1973, one of the most prestigious philosophical lecture series in the English-speaking world, dedicated since their founding in the late 19th century to the philosophy of natural theology and the widest questions of human life and purpose. She used the invitation to present the framework of an inquiry she intended to carry through 3 volumes. an examination of the three fundamental activities of the thinking life, which she called thinking, willing, and judging. She'd been working toward this project for years, had given smaller versions of the relevant lectures at various universities, and now had the occasion to present the larger structure. The Aberdeen lectures became the basis for the 2 volumes she completed. The third she did not live to write. The first volume, on thinking, opens with the Socratic example and never fully leaves it. Socrates was, in Arendt's reading, something genuinely unusual in the history of philosophy. A thinker who was not primarily interested in finding correct answers to philosophical questions, but in demonstrating that the questions were more serious than the accepted answers to them. He went to the Athenian craftsmen and politicians and poets who were confident they knew what their particular skill or virtue or art consisted of, and he asked them to define it. And then, through a series of further questions, he demonstrated that the definitions could not survive scrutiny, that the certainties people carried through their daily lives had not been thought through and could not withstand examination. The Athenians found this activity intolerable and eventually condemned him to death for it, which told Arendt something important about the relationship between thinking and political life. The important thing about Socratic practice, in her account, is not that it produces knowledge. It does not. Socrates' interlocutors emerge from his conversations not wiser in the sense of possessing new true beliefs, but more uncertain, more aware of the gaps in their understanding, less confident that what they thought they knew was genuinely known. This is not a failure but an achievement, because it is the discovery of the specific activity of thinking as distinct from the accumulation of information. Thinking, as Arendt understands it following Socrates, is not the acquisition of correct beliefs. It is the activity of examining beliefs, of holding them up to the light of self-scrutiny, of engaging in the inner dialogue of the self with itself that she calls the two-in-one. The two-in-one is her most original contribution to the philosophy of thinking. Every person who genuinely thinks is, in this account, engaged in a kind of interior conversation, a dialogue between the self that holds a position and the self that questions that position, a back and forth that cannot be reduced to the simple operation of applying logical rules to given premises. This inner dialogue presupposes a kind of internal plurality, a self that is capable of disagreeing with itself, of surprising itself, of being genuinely uncertain about things it had been certain of a moment before. And this internal plurality is, she argues, the cognitive analogue of the external plurality of human beings that she had identified as the condition of political action. Just as genuine political life requires the presence of distinct others who can challenge and surprise each other, genuine thinking requires the presence of the other within the self, the capacity for the self to be its own interlocutor. Thinking, in this account, is essentially a withdrawal from the world of appearances. When I am thinking, I have left the common world of shared perception and entered a realm that is not immediately visible to others, a realm of the mind's own activity. This withdrawal is not permanent, not a final abandonment of the world, but a temporary retreat that is the condition of genuine engagement when one returns. The thinker who returns from thinking to the world of appearances brings with them something they did not have before, not answers necessarily, but a different relationship to the questions, a greater capacity to notice what is really being asked and to resist the comfort of answers that have not been genuinely examined. She also argues that thinking has a specific and paradoxical relationship to convention and accepted opinion. Thinking dissolves conventions. This is one of its most important features and one of the most politically consequential. The person who genuinely thinks about the values they have received from their social environment, who genuinely submits those values to the scrutiny of the inner dialogue, will find that many of them cannot survive examination, that their certainty depended on not being examined rather than on their intrinsic validity. This dissolution of conventions is not in itself a moral achievement. It can produce the nihilist who, having discovered that conventional morality cannot fully justify itself, concludes that nothing matters. But it is the necessary condition of genuine moral reflection, because a person who has never submitted their received values to examination has not in any meaningful sense chosen to hold those values. They have simply inherited them and carried them unreflectively, which is precisely the condition Arendt had identified in Eichmann. The second volume, on willing, traces a very different mental faculty through a remarkable range of Western philosophical sources. The will is the mental faculty oriented toward the future, toward what has not yet happened, toward the act that is about to be performed rather than the thought that is being examined. It is the faculty of beginning, of initiation, of the gap between intention and performance that in some sense constitutes the core of what it means to be a free agent. Arendt argues that the ancient Greeks had no real concept of the will in this sense, because their philosophical framework was organized around a model of the mind in which the highest activity was contemplation of eternal truths rather than initiation of new acts in the temporal world. The sage who contemplates the eternal is not willing anything. They are receiving, absorbing, recognizing. The will only becomes philosophically important when the philosophical tradition takes seriously the notion that the temporal world, the world of events and actions and new beginnings, is not merely an inferior copy of the eternal world, but a realm with its own dignity and its own philosophical interest. It was Augustine, she argues, who gave Western philosophy its first sustained account of the will as a distinct and irreducible faculty, and he did so in the context of the problem that had been his own personal crisis before becoming his philosophical subject, the problem of the will that is divided against itself. Augustine's great insight was that the will is not simply a mechanism that executes the commands of reason. It is a faculty capable of conflicting with itself, of willing what it does not want and not willing what it wants. His reading of Paul's letter to the Romans, the account of the person who does the evil they do not want and fails to do the good they want, stayed with Augustine throughout his philosophical life as the description of a condition that required explanation, and his explanation was the account of the fallen will, the will weakened by sin and therefore unable to achieve the unity of purpose that a fully functioning faculty would have. Arendt reads this account of the divided will not as a specifically theological doctrine, but as a philosophical discovery. The discovery that freedom is not simply the absence of external constraint, but an internal achievement, that the free will is something that has to be won against the internal resistance of a faculty that tends toward division rather than unity. The subsequent history of philosophical accounts of the will, which she traces through figures including Duns Scotus and Nietzsche and Heidegger, is the history of successive attempts to resolve the Augustinian paradox, to achieve an account of the will that preserves its freedom without reducing it to the kind of arbitrary choice that has no genuine connection to the rest of the person who makes it. The third faculty, judging, was to have been the subject of the final volume. She had been thinking about judging for years, had associated it with the political dimension of Kant's aesthetic theory, had given lectures and seminars in which the outlines of her approach were visible. Kant's account of aesthetic judgment had this feature that she found philosophically crucial. The aesthetic judgment claims a kind of universal validity, claims that the thing judged is genuinely beautiful or genuinely worthy of admiration, and yet this claim cannot be grounded in a rule or concept that could be mechanically applied to any case. The judgment of the particular is not the application of a general rule to a specific instance. It is something else, something that requires a capacity for seeing the particular in its particularity, while simultaneously placing it in a larger context. A judgment that is neither purely subjective nor derivable from objective rules, but occupies a middle space that is the space of genuine political and moral judgment. She had written about this capacity in various contexts, had used the phrase representative thinking to describe the enlarged mentality that Kant associated with the aesthetic judge, and had argued that this enlarged mentality, the capacity to think from the standpoints of others, was also the capacity required by genuine political judgment. A politician who can only see political situations from their own position, from the position defined by their party or their ideology or their national community, has the same deficiency that Eichmann had in the moral domain. They cannot genuinely take into account the perspectives of those who see things differently, and therefore they cannot exercise the kind of judgment that political life requires. On the evening of December 4th, 1975, the sheet of paper she had placed in her typewriter at her apartment on Riverside Drive contained a title and 2 epigraphs. Nothing more. She had been working throughout the autumn on the opening of the judging volume and had not yet written a word of the body of the text. When her friends came to the apartment that night, they found her in her chair, not at her desk. She had come in for coffee, it appeared, and had died where she sat. The sheet of paper in the typewriter, with its title and its 2 epigraphs and its blank expectation of the text that would follow, remained in the machine until someone thought to remove it. Mary McCarthy took charge of the papers and the manuscripts and spent the next 3 years preparing The Life of the Mind for publication. It appeared in 2 volumes in 1978. The 3rd volume on judging was never written, and the question of what it would have said remains one of the most productive open questions in the scholarship that has gathered around Arendt's work in the decades since her death. Mary McCarthy, as literary executor, organised the fragmentary materials Arendt had assembled for the judging volume and published a selection of them. Among the most important of these fragments were the lectures on Kant's political philosophy that Arendt had given at the New School for Social Research in the 1970s, lectures in which she had worked through Kant's account of aesthetic judgment with the explicit purpose of extracting from it a theory of political judgment. These lectures were published posthumously and have been widely read as the closest approximation available to what the 3rd volume would have contained. In the Kant lectures, she develops the connection between aesthetic judgment and political judgment with a care and a detail that her earlier writings had gestured toward but never fully articulated. The key move is the identification of the faculty that Kant calls taste, the capacity to say with some claim to general validity that something is beautiful, with the faculty of political judgment, the capacity to say with some claim to general validity that a political act or a political situation is good or just or worthy of admiration. Both faculties operate on particular cases without deriving from universal rules. Both require the enlarged mentality, the representative thinking, that she had associated with genuine moral and political capacity since the Eichmann case. And both are, in Kant's account, essentially communicative. They are exercises in making one's own judgment available to others, in inviting others to share a perspective that one has formed through the genuine consideration of other perspectives. What the 3rd volume would have done with these materials, how it would have extended the Kantian analysis into a systematic account of political judgment and its relationship to the activities of thinking and willing that the first 2 volumes had examined, remains genuinely unknown. The absence is not only a biographical loss, it is a permanent opening in the structure of the work, a space that subsequent thinkers have filled with their own interpretations and proposals, none of which can claim the authority of what Arendt herself would have written. This incompleteness is, in its own way, true to the nature of the activity she was trying to describe. Judgment, as she understood it, was never a completed system. It was always an activity, always a fresh engagement with the particular case, always requiring the exercise of a capacity that could not be reduced to a procedure. The unfinished volume enacts, in the biographical fact of its absence, the philosophical point it would have made. During her lifetime, Arendt occupied an uncomfortable position in the intellectual landscape. She was famous, genuinely famous in the way that few academic philosophers manage to be, with a public profile that reached well beyond university departments and across the Atlantic in both directions. The origins of totalitarianism had given her name a weight that the Eichmann controversy only amplified, if perversely. She was invited to major conferences, her lectures drew large audiences, her essays were published in the most prominent intellectual journals of the English-speaking world. And yet within the specific communities whose approval might have been expected to follow from this fame, she was consistently a source of friction rather than admiration. The Jewish intellectual world, particularly in New York and in Israel, had never fully recovered from the Eichmann controversy, and many of those who had most forcefully objected to her reporting continued to regard her as someone who had, at a moment of maximum historical seriousness, chosen provocation over solidarity. The academic left found her useless for their purposes. She refused to endorse Marxism, refused to treat economic conditions as the fundamental determinants of political possibility, refused to subordinate the question of political freedom to the question of economic justice, and refused to provide the kind of systemic critique of capitalism that left intellectuals of her generation were expected to produce. Liberals, who might have claimed her as their own, were disturbed by her criticism of representative government and her apparent longing for a model of direct political participation that seemed, to most practical politicians, entirely unrealizable. The political scientists found her too philosophical. The philosophers found her too political. The historians found her method insufficiently empirical, arguing that she imposed a grand historical narrative on materials that would have supported a more careful and more modest analysis. The literary intellectuals found her prose, in English at least, too formidable and too foreign in its rhythms, carrying the marks of a German intellectual formation that did not translate easily into the American idiom. She belonged, as she was well aware, to no school and no faction, and she had no interest in founding one. She wrote from a position of principled intellectual independence that she had maintained through decades of political controversy, and that independence, while it made her a figure of great individual integrity, did not make her an easy intellectual property for any of the camps that might have benefited from claiming her. She died in December 1975, and the immediate response in most of the obituary writing was to present her as an important but finally marginal thinker, a figure of the mid-century whose work was substantially complete and whose reputation would likely settle at a respectable but not central place in the history of political thought. This assessment turned out to be almost entirely wrong. The revival began slowly in the years immediately following her death and gathered force through the 1980s and 90s in ways that none of her critics or champions of the 1960s had anticipated. Elizabeth Young Bruhl, who had been one of Arendt's students at the New School for Social Research in New York, published a biography in 1982, Hannah Arendt, for love of the world, that introduced her life and thought to a new generation of readers with a sympathetic depth and scholarly thoroughness that the public controversies of her lifetime had made impossible. Young Bruhl's biography did not evade the controversies. It addressed them directly, with full access to the correspondence and the personal accounts of those who had known Arendt, while insisting that the controversies had distorted the reception of a body of work that deserved to be read as the sustained philosophical achievement it was, rather than as a series of provocations. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc between 1989 and 1991 gave a very specific and somewhat unexpected impetus to the Arendt revival. Readers and scholars who had lived through those events found themselves returning to the origins of totalitarianism with a kind of recognition that the Cold War framework, in which the book had often been read as a weapon of liberal anti-communism, had prevented. The book's analysis of totalitarianism as a genuinely new political phenomenon, its insistence that it could not be understood through the traditional categories of despotism and tyranny, its account of the atomization and loneliness that provided the social substrate for totalitarian movements. All of this proved not merely historically accurate, but analytically alive in the new political situations that the post-communist world was generating. Eastern European intellectuals who had been reading Arendt in samizdat for years brought her work into the mainstream of the democratic theory that was being rebuilt in the former Soviet bloc, finding in her concepts of action, power, and the public realm resources for thinking about what democratic self-governance might actually mean as a practical form of life rather than an abstract ideal. In the 1990s and the first 2 decades of the 21st century, Arendt became something very close to a canonical figure in political philosophy. Her works assigned in university courses across Europe and North America, translated into dozens of languages, the subject of an expanding secondary literature that now numbers in the thousands of books and articles. The reading of her work diversified along with its audience, generating interpretive traditions that were not always compatible with each other, but that agreed on the fundamental seriousness of the engagement she demanded. Salah Ben-Habib's scholarship, developed in a series of books beginning in the 1996, positioned Arendt as a thinker who had resources for a theory of deliberative democracy, a form of democratic theory that emphasized the importance of genuine public deliberation among citizens rather than the mere aggregation of pre-given preferences. In this reading, Arendt's concept of the space of appearance and her account of the conditions for genuine political action become the foundation for a defense of democratic institutions, grounded in a richer understanding of what political participation means than liberal theory had typically offered. Ben-Habib also pressed on the tensions in Arendt's work, particularly on the relationship between the universal claims of human rights discourse and her insistence on the political grounding of all rights, in particular political communities, a tension that had become central to debates about international human rights law. Dana Villa's scholarship explored the complicated relationship between Arendt and her former teacher with a philosophical precision that many earlier readers had avoided. Villa argued that Arendt had absorbed far more from that philosophical relationship than she sometimes acknowledged, that her concept of action drew substantially on an account of authentic existence that she had transformed and politicized, and that the full significance of her political philosophy could only be grasped in the context of this intellectual inheritance and her complex transformation of it. The argument about this intellectual genealogy remains one of the most productive tensions in Arendt studies, because it touches on the deepest questions about the relationship between political thinking and the broader tradition of European philosophy from which she emerged and against which she had to define herself. The feminist reception of Arendt has been complicated from the beginning and has never settled into consensus. On one side, feminist political theorists have found her distinction between the public and private realms philosophically troubling, since the traditional alignment of women with the private sphere and men with the public is one of the structural mechanisms by which women were historically excluded from political life, and a theory that treats the public realm as the uniquely valuable space of human freedom risks reinforcing this exclusion rather than challenging it. Arendt herself did not identify as a feminist and showed relatively little interest in the systematic analysis of gender as a political category, which some feminist thinkers found a significant gap in her analysis of the conditions of political participation. On the other side, a different strand of feminist thought has found in her concept of natality, in her account of action as beginning, and in her emphasis on plurality as the fundamental political condition, resources for a political theory that takes seriously the experience of embodiment and of birth in a way that much of the Western philosophical tradition has ignored, a tradition organized, as Arendt herself noted, around the experience of death rather than the experience of arrival. The aspect of her thought that has proved most urgently prescient and that has generated the most intense contemporary engagement is her analysis of the refugee and the stateless person as the representative figure of the modern political order. She had argued that the supposed universality of human rights had revealed a fundamental internal contradiction when put to the test. The rights proclaimed as inalienable and belonging to every human being simply by virtue of their humanity were in practice enforceable only by the nation-state, and the nation-state could only protect the rights of its own citizens. The person who had no state, who had been expelled from their national community, or whose community had been destroyed, was in practice a person without rights, a human being whose humanity was acknowledged in principle and ignored in practice. The displaced persons of the post-war period, the stateless refugees of the interwar years, had demonstrated this gap between the universal language of rights and the national reality of their enforcement, with a force that the comfortable abstractions of rights discourse had preferred not to acknowledge. In the early decades of the 21st century, this analysis has acquired a relevance that Arendt could not have anticipated in its specific form, but that she had, in its structural features, described with extraordinary precision. The mass displacements of the Syrian conflict, the refugee crises in the Mediterranean and on the borders of Europe and North America, the political responses ranging from humanitarian emergency measures to systematic exclusion and deliberate deterrence. All of these have sent readers back to her account of what it means to be a person without a place in the political order, a human being whose rights exist only in theory. The passage from The Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she describes the right to have rights, the right to belong to a political community that can protect one's other rights, as the fundamental political right that the modern era has systematically failed to guarantee, has become one of the most cited passages in contemporary political theory. Her concept of action as beginning, her insistence that the capacity for new beginnings is irreducible and cannot be extinguished even by the most catastrophic political conditions, has attracted the attention of political movements that have tried to create new political realities in circumstances that seem to preclude them. The idea that political power arises when people act together in concert, that it is not a thing that can be stored or transferred, but a phenomenon that exists only as long as the concerted action persists, has given political actors a vocabulary for describing what they experience in moments of genuine collective self-governance that the older languages of politics and political science had difficulty capturing. Whether in the solidarity movements of the 1980s, in the democratic uprisings of the Arab Spring, or in the council-like structures that social movements have repeatedly invented for themselves, the Arendtian model of power as concerted action has found new instances. She remains, in the early 21st century, one of the few political philosophers of the 20th century whose work addresses with equal seriousness the destruction that century achieved and the conditions under which something genuinely political might be preserved or rebuilt in its aftermath. She ended her life with the question of judgment unresolved, with the final volume unwritten, with the sheet of paper in the typewriter and nothing on it but a title and 2 epigraphs. This incompleteness is not simply a biographical accident, it is a philosophical provocation that her work leaves permanently open. We know that judgment is necessary. We know something of what it requires, but the systematic account of what it is and how it works died with her in the gap between the typed title and the text that was never written. Her work offers us the question at its fullest depth. The answer it leaves to us: what makes Arendt unusual among the major political philosophers of the 20th century is that she was formed by the catastrophe she analysed. She was not a comfortable academic theorising about events she had read about in newspapers. She had been arrested by the Gestapo, interned in a camp, made stateless, and had escaped a continent that was murdering people like her. The thinking she brought to these events was shaped by that formation in ways that cannot be entirely separated from the specific arguments she made. She thought about totalitarianism as someone who had experienced its approach, about statelessness as someone who had been stateless, about the loss of world as someone who had lost one world and built another in its place. This is not to say that her arguments are merely autobiographical, or that their validity depends on her biography rather than on their intellectual content. It is to say that the seriousness with which she pressed the questions, the urgency she brought to the insistence that clarity about these matters was not optional but morally necessary, was inseparable from the life that had made the questions urgent. Thinkers who come to Arendt for the first time sometimes find her difficult. Her arguments are dense, her philosophical references are demanding, and her willingness to take positions that cut across the established divisions of political opinion can be disorienting. But those who persist find very often that the difficulty resolves into something that feels less like argument and more like recognition, the recognition of phenomena that have been in front of them all along, and that they had not, before reading her, found the words to see clearly. This is what the best political philosophy does, and she does it with a consistency that very few of her contemporaries in the 20th century could match. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to vote on what comes next, you can do that on our website, slphilosophyradio.com. While you are there, check out the full transcript, works cited, recommended reading list, and some other materials we put together for this one. You can find all the links down in the description. If you enjoyed this, a like, a subscribe, or just sharing this video with someone who might appreciate it really does make a difference, and I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, take care.